Hi and welcome everyone to the third session of DevHour. This time we will work a little bit with configuring CI/CD pipelines using GitHub Actions. And the presenters, as last time as well, is myself, Martin, and Jarmo Lindmark. Before we start, we will talk a little bit about what we did last time. So last time we built some Docker containers for our 3 microservices. And we defined Kubernetes pods and services and an ingress that we deployed locally in our Minikube. And we used the kubectl to manage the actual deployment. And for those of you who haven't seen the previous session or missed out, it's available on YouTube. And this will also be recorded and available on YouTube within a week or so. And as always, you can find all the information you need at either Meetup or in our Git repository.
Yeah, we have disabled you being able to show your own cameras, and this is for GDPR reasons. So since we record everything, so your faces don't show up there either.
Yeah, and if you have any questions, by the way, just write them in the chat, and Jarmo will let me know, and we will stop the presentation a little bit and talk about the question perhaps. It will be quite fast, this presentation today, because we have 1 hour, but we're going to set up a full pipeline and run a full deployment, and there are a couple of steps involved in this, so run it quite fast. But I hope you will enjoy it. Right, so today we will start by configuring our Maven versioning to work with the CI/CD. So the first session and the second session where we created our Spring Boot applications, we used the snapshot version for Maven. But that will not work so well when we go into automating our builds and deployment, because then we want real versioning. And we will show you how that can be done in one way. There are multiple ways to do this. We will use a very simple way to get it forward. And then we will look into the GitHub Actions, what they mean and how they actually work with the pipeline. And then we will use these pipelines to push our Docker containers into AWS Elastic Container Registry. And then we will use something called HELM charts. And we will create them. I will show you what they are used for, and we will talk a little bit more about that before we start, actually. And finally, we'll run the deployment using HELM into AWS Elastic Kubernetes Service. And hopefully we'll have something to show, or at least a web page to reach using the actuators that we used before. So a lot of things to take in, and it will go quite fast. So I hope you enjoy it, and maybe you have to review this later on if you haven't worked with it before, and I hope we learn a lot. But first, this is the pipeline overview. So what will happen is that once we push in code to GitHub, the GitHub repository contains multiple things that we can use, and one of those things is the GitHub Actions. So it's the actual project in GitHub that handles the actions. So our steps will be that we first will build the jar files using Maven and use our new way of versioning each jar file. Then we will build containers and upload those to Amazon. So our Kubernetes instance can actually reach the images. You can, of course, use something else than AWS container registry if you want to. But yeah, we want to keep it in Amazon because it's simpler. And then we will actually run the deployment that will update the cluster with the latest versions, so it knows what container versions to actually use within our specification. And just a reminder, I showed this last time as well, but this is what our instance in Amazon looks like for our Kubernetes cluster. So you have a control plane where you actually manage the cluster, and the actual application code goes into 4 gate pods. That's where our containers are eventually running. And we have an application load balancer that actually talks to our ingress. And the ingress service itself manages what pods belongs to what service and things like that. So we actually get routed to the correct areas. This is quite a standard setup. You can do very many different setups with this, but this is what we see as a very simple getting started way of using EKS. And I mentioned HELM. So what is HELM? It's more or less a package manager for Kubernetes. And if you ever use like Yum or apt or something like that, you can think about it as the same way. It's a way to manage packages that you want to deploy into your services with definitions. And it gives a lot of extra help to avoid working a lot with YAML files, which can become quite cumbersome when you have a lot of services and pods and versioning and things like that. Then Helm is a really good way of managing it. Helm can also listen to changes in your repository. We will not do that today, but it can use webhooks to listen to your repository for changes and help you out with the deployment as well. And the way you work with Helm is that you define shards, and the shard more or less contain the definition of the YAML files, but it has an extra script layer, so you can actually have variables inside your pod file definition, for example. And we will look more into that. But enough slides, so let's start coding. I'll show you really quick first. So this is GitHub Actions. Wait, my scroll is pretty fast. Just so you get a feeling of what you are actually building when we build a GitHub action. So it's a YAML definition. In this case, it's a demo where they have a name and when it should be triggered.
Bigger?
Yeah, I can make it bigger, sorry. Of course. Is this better? So they define a job and it's going to be triggered when you push in code. In this case, whenever you push code, this will happen. You could define it on different branches or a merge request or whatever you want. There are a lot of options. And it runs on Ubuntu and it runs on different steps. And one of the key aspects here is that it uses something called Actions checkout, in this case version 2. This will actually check out the repository. You don't have access to the repository just because you run a GitHub action. You actually have to check it out, which this action helps you with. And when you think about actions, it's a way to package behavior that you want to reuse. So there is a large open community where you can download different actions. For example, we will be using from AWS their actions to push code towards AWS, and you can build your own, and it's a really good thing to use, and I strongly recommend that you check out what's available. And we will look more into the details about what the ones look like that we will be using. So if you haven't seen any kind of YAML definition for running pipelines before, this is a very typical structure, and I prefer usually going into GitLab. That's my main area, but I use GitHub as well, and they are very similar. But I would say that one of the strong points of GitHub is actually these actions that are give a lot without a lot of work. So strongly recommend you to look into that. But okay, so let's get started with the actual programming here. For those of you who haven't been with us before, the structure here is that we have the first session first, and then we have the second session, and now we are in the third session. So I more or less copied the second session into the third session, and we will start working with this one and then later push it on. So as I mentioned, we need to manage versions in Maven. And to do that, we have our POM file. And as you can see, it says this is the parent POM. It has a version 0 snapshot, and that is not really great, of course, when you push something in. So I'm gonna, instead of using 0 snapshot here, I'm gonna add a variable. And to do that, we have properties. Do you want me to zoom a little bit, Jorma? Yeah. I will zoom a little bit, maybe too much, something like that. Yeah, okay. So then I'm gonna add a new tag here, or a new property. I'm gonna call it revision. I'm gonna still use 0 snapshot here because that's what we want locally. But then I can use this and instead write up here in the versioning, I can use my revision. Oh, sorry, I'm pressing the wrong keys here. It's been a while since I worked with my Mac. I can use the revision tag here. So now the POM parent will take its version from the property. And as most of you know, you can send in these properties when you actually build with Maven. So you can provide them on the command line, and that's what we will use later on. But it's not just enough to add it here. We actually have to have this version tag in our sub-modules as well. So let's go into the order service, the POM file. I'm going to say the parent will be this version. And we also actually want this artifact as well to be this version. And then we do the same for product service. A little bit repetitive here, but it's what's needed. And then we can do the same for report service as well. Okay, so now they all use revision, and I can build that while we're actually talking here. So let's do a Maven clean install. It should still be 0 snapshot if everything is compiling correctly, since that was the default value. And that's one thing that we needed to change. But we also want our Docker files to be using the same revision number. So as you remember, we created Docker files. So in this case, in the order service, we say copy what we built from the target folder into the container. But here it says 0 snapshot, and that will not work when we run in a pipeline. So here we actually have to take in an argument, which can look like this. So we say arg, call it version, equals, we're just going to put some default value here. Maybe it should be 0 snapshot, but yeah, I'm just going to call it version for now. So then, instead of 0 snapshot down here, we say $, and we say version. And then I think that should be it for this one. And then we need to do the same for all the other containers as well. Now our build was successful. We can just make sure it built the snapshots. Yeah, parent snapshot was still built. Yeah, report service snapshot. Great. So let's fix the product service. We had a version. We do a variable here, call it version. And we go and do the same for the report. All right.
And is there a way of having like a shared Docker file or maybe like a template, so you wouldn't have to?
Yeah. I mean, you can of course template if you want to, but the big problem here is that we actually build our 3 microservices in one repository. That's not usually how you work, right? You want one repository to represent one microservice. So that's the real answer to solving a problem with that. You don't want there would be only one template, which would be your Docker file. But this is just because it's easier for us to actually present and push it to Git later on and have a kind of a product setup. It would be a little bit complicated to manage multiple repositories and sharing that with everyone. Okay, great question. So now we have that in place. Let me just check my notes here. Now we want to start adding actions for GitHub to actually build our jar files. And for that to be picked up by GitHub, we need to add it into a folder, which is actually in the root of our project. So unfortunately, I can't place that in our subcatalog that we actually are working in, because that will not be picked up by GitHub Actions. Maybe there is a way to do this. I'm not sure. As I mentioned before, I'm more of a GitLab guy, but this is a way that it actually works. So I'm just going to use vanilla here and hope that maybe there are possibilities to have multiple flows, but my current knowledge says that it doesn't work. So a new directory. We're going to create a new file in here. We're going to call it GitHub Actions. You can name it whatever you want. GitHub Actions YAML file. Okay, like that. We're gonna add it. Right, so what will it contain? Well, the first thing is that we need a name. Simple as that. Let's call it DevHour pipeline. And as we saw before, we need to say when do we want to trigger this. And we want to trigger it on a push. We will keep it very simple here, very vanilla. So of course you can change to whatever you want whenever you try this out. And then we're gonna define the job, or the jobs rather. In this case, we're gonna start with the first job, which we will just call build. So this is a name. It has nothing to do with anything else. It's just a name. But then we need to define what it runs on. And in this case, I want it to run on Ubuntu. I want it to be the latest version. You can define your own, whatever versions you want that are available on GitHub. You need to look into their release cycles of the build machines to get all the values. Then we're gonna have make it a little bit easier here for us to actually define a working catalog. So by default it will work from the root level, but we want to define a different area. So we say run under defaults, and we say working directory, and then we say 3 configure CI CD pipelines. Okay. So now we have a default, and we will be working in the default directory of where we're actually standing right now, and we will be running on Ubuntu. Now we define the steps that we want to perform, and the first thing we will do is we will say uses actions. As I mentioned before, these are pre-packaged what you want to call it, run commands or whatever. It's like a CLI call. In this case, I want to check out our code. And I'm going to be using version 2 of this. So there are different release versions, of course, of actions. I'm not sure, check out this latest, but that's what I've been using the most. So we will just hope that works fine. And then we will also say actions set up Java. And that's also version 2. So we want to have Java installed on the worker nodes that we get assigned from GitHub. So when you actually trigger a pipeline, you get the worker node. That worker node will perform everything you want to run. Keep in mind that each job will have its own worker node. So that means that you can't rely on each job to have the same information. So if I were running 2 jobs at the same time, maybe both of them need to check out the code, for example. In this case, I also want to add a property. I want to say that we want to run on Java 17. And the distribution of this one is adopt. Okay. And now we can actually define what we want to perform, which is a run command. As I mentioned before, we want to do a Maven clean install. So we do Maven, but we also want to say we have a revision number. That was the first thing we changed, right? So we actually get something that is not zero snapshot. Revision equals, and in this case we will use some of the predefined variables you get from GitHub Actions, which is GitHub SHA. And in this case we only want the first 7. So this is the actual commit SHA you get, which is, I don't know how many characters it is, but it's a lot more than 7. But we only want the 7 first because we don't want too long numbers. And then we do the clean install. So when we build our jar files now, they will have this revision number, hopefully, and we should be fine and dandy. But as I mentioned, we want to add multiple steps later on as well. After this has been built, we have jar files in the target folder, but that doesn't mean anything. We need to use these for something more. And for that, we say we take the uses again. In this case, the actions is upload artifact. And that means that we store a temporary artifact that we can use in other jobs as well. And we want to provide some more details. We want to say that the name is going to be called DevHour build. That's just a name. You can give it whatever name you want, as long as you can remember it and reference it later. And then I want to define a path. What do we want to store in this artifact? Well, in our case, I'm actually going to do like this. Oh, sorry. 1 second. Something happened with my keyboard. I'm going to do like that. We're going to say, I want to store the whole folder. This is obviously not the perfect way of doing it. Maybe you just want to store the jar files, but for now we're going to keep it simple. So I'm going to store pipelines. And that's more or less it. To actually set up a pipeline that runs on Java 17 on Ubuntu. It runs in our working directory, and it should hopefully build us an artifact that we can be using. So I'm going to store this. I'm going to use Git here. I'm going to commit this and say, presentation maybe push 1, and hope everything works. It's really easy to live code and do a mistake, so let's just hope this flies. So now I'm switching to our repository. This is everything and DevHour. So this is where we are working. I'm going to reload it here. And as you can see up here, there is an actions button. So I'm going to press that. And it's running. Something is running. So we at least they got it triggered. And as you can see, I obviously have done a lot of pushes before, but I've reset that for testing the presentation material. So what does it look like? Well, it's building. In this case, we'll have one job step. So and we call it build. So that's, if you name it something else, that's what will show up here. And if we dig into it a little bit more, we can see what it's actually doing. Seems to be doing fine. Running Maven, and it's actually uploading. And yeah, seems to be have gone green. And if we look into detail on the Maven part here, let's see. It's a very long list. We can see in the end what it actually built. Very, very far down. Obviously, we need to limit the logs here if we were to put this in production. Did we just have some build errors? No, it was test errors. Okay, so it seems we built a report service with the SHA number, so that seems to be fine. Yeah. 0 failures, everything seems to be fine. Okay, great. And if we can probably look into the upload area. I've actually never followed this one out before, but we have report service, product service, order service, all with jar files with GitHub SHA. So that's great. Now we have the jar files, but they don't really do anything for us yet. So with that, we need to build the next step, which is to package and deploy this. So let's go back to the code. I need to hurry up a little bit, I think I'm already behind the schedule a little bit. So, what's the next step? Yeah, as I mentioned, we need to have a new job. So we need to go to the right line here. I'm going to call it package, and push. We're going to depend on the previous step. So it depends on build. So we can't run this before the build step has been run. That's an important key for us here. So it needs build. And it also runs on Ubuntu latest. And we're going to have some steps. And we're going to say uses. In this case, we will download what we just had, the artifact we uploaded, because we needed it on this machine as well. So we're going to call up actions, download artifact, version 3 in this case. And we're going to give it an ID so we can reference it later. And we're going to call it build with name. Yeah, this is probably not the perfect naming, but it works. Right, so now we will have the artifacts, and it's time to I'm gonna actually configure AWS a little bit earlier than intended perhaps, but that means that we can actually log into AWS as well, because we need to configure some global properties. And I will show you how that is done as well. So in this case, we're going to configure AWS credentials, because we need those. We need to be accessing our instance. So when I say name, that's just a prefix, so it looks better in the log, so you can see what it's actually doing. But it's still the same, because we're going to be uses AWS action, and it's configure AWS credentials, and in this case it's the version 1. And with AWS access key ID. And in this case, I'm going to take this in from my GitHub project. So we want to define this in GitHub. And I will show you, I have already done that, but I will show you where it's done. In this case, it's called secrets. And I've named the secret AWS access key ID. And then we do the same. I'm going to do a copy and paste here to save some time. I'm going to have another called AWS secret access key. And these are more or less what you always need when you want to talk to AWS. So for those of you who have ever tried to push something to AWS, you will recognize these, the access key and the secret access key. And these are usually something you have added to your account, or if you're allowed to push to your EKS instance. Okay, so now we've configured some credentials, but we also need to actually do a login. So I'm going to just name this login to Amazon ECR, and I'm going to say ID login ECR. We need that later, and it uses AWS Actions. So all of these are provided by Amazon. Amazon ECR login version 1.
Where would we find those actions?
Whenever you need a new action and you think that perhaps there is an action available, I will just Google Amazon GitHub Actions, and then they have a huge list. They usually come in their open source areas for Amazon. And you can. There is also, when you create a new GitHub project, and if you press the Actions tab, if you're the owner of the repository, you will get like a guide to select and search the whole store where all the registered actions are available. Okay, so now it's time to actually build something. So now we can imagine that we have configured AWS secrets. We will log in to Amazon. We have access. So the next step is to actually build and deploy our images. I'm sorry for going a little bit fast with this, but it's to save time. All right, so I'm going to do like that. Oops, sorry, my bad. Okay, so now we do Docker build. We've done this before. We're going to tag the image, and it's going to be tagged with also another secret. In this case, it's called, I call it ECR registry. So that's the address to our actual registry. You will get your personal address when you create a ECR registry. And then I'm going to place it, in this case, order service. And I want it to be order service, and then we need a version, of course, and the version is, as we mentioned before, the GitHub tag. So we go with GitHub show, and 7 characters of that. We don't want the full one. And the actual path to where we find this is in /order service. My bad, sorry, I'm just gonna scroll a little bit here. My microphone is a little bit in the way. Order service, and we want to add arguments. So this is the way to provide arguments when you use Docker. So when you use your Docker file to build and provide it with arguments. So we'll say build args, and in this case it's the version we want to provide, and that's the same as we had here, of course. Version equals GitHub shell. And now we need to do the same for all our for both the product service and report service as well. So I'm just going to copy paste this in here, so don't be surprised that a lot of code shows up, just to save some time. I'm going to do like this actually, it goes faster. So now we have for product service and report service, and now it's time to actually push it. So one problem there is with GitHub Actions today is that if you actually build a container in one job and want to use it in another job, there is no way that is really good to actually pass that container to the next job, because they are running on different machines. So that's why we're actually building and pushing it in the same machine. Sometimes you maybe want to have some testing steps in between here as well, but for now we keep it very simple. We just push it straight away. But however, keep in mind that it's a little bit tricky to share Docker containers when you actually build them between jobs in GitHub. So one way of doing it would be to, for example, to have a test repository where you can actually push your container and then download it again and test on it, for example. But the shortcut is obviously to do everything in the same job. So now we will push this to do like this, Docker push, and we want to use the secret again. We want to have this guy. Okay, so that's the one we want to push, right? And that's it. We don't have to mention anything more. So now we can do the same for the other three, or other two, sorry. And then we have the report service. And we want to, in this case, I'm just going to actually mention the shell we want to run in. It's bash. Okay, so now we're building it and we're pushing it up. We can actually push this in and hope it works while I continue talking about the other steps, because it takes a little bit of a time. So while that is running, I'm going to show you where to define the secrets in GitHub. So now we're back to GitHub. If you go to settings, you have, oops, that's a very fast scroll. You have something called secrets, and those are the ones we actually used. And in this case, they are repository secrets. I've defined ECR registry. We have some kube data configuration that's needed. And this is actually something you will need to add as well, kube configuration. You can get that from your own local kube, or you can Google how to actually get it correct. But it's just it's to connect to your Kubernetes instance, more or less. We will use it a little bit later. And then, as you saw as well, the access key and the secret access key as well. AWS profile I don't think you need, because that's something special that I've used. But that's the simple way to actually get the secrets in and use in your GitHub Actions. So you just define them and they are encrypted for you. Alright, so let's get back to the code while that builds. Alright, so if this goes well, we will have deployed our or pushed our containers to Docker, or to the Docker repository in Amazon. And now we have 20 minutes left, so I have to speed up again. The next step is for us to start working with HELM. Now we want to deploy this. So why are we even using HELM for this? Can't we just update the AWS pods, for example? Well, The short answer is no, or you can, but how would you know the version numbers of your images? So if we look at the pod file, it has a image, which version in this case, in the old one, it says 1.0. Well, now we have a hash number that we can't really calculate and then know which one it is. So, for example, in this case, Helm helps us a lot to actually define this. So I'm going to start by creating a new folder. I'm going to call it Helm charts. And for excuse me, some water. For the first, the things you need that are the first thing you need is a chart. It's a YAML. We'll add that, and in the chart you more or less just define like what is contained here. So it's not anything important. I'm just going to paste this in. You more or less just define that what's the name of this chart. And then we will add templates. So the templates are more or less the files we already had in our Kubernetes definition here of the ingress, pod, and service. You know what? I'm actually going to copy these in. It goes faster. So we take these as we defined before, but now we call them templates in Helm. And we're going to add them. Yes, sure, why not? All right. So now we have the same. It would actually deploy the exact same thing that we had before if we run this. But that's not something we want, right? We actually want to have new definitions on the images. With that said, we need to replace this, the one in the pod file, with a version number that we will get from our pipelines. And to do that, you can use values or variables, but they are called values in Helm. So to do this, you do like this, and you say, I'm going to use values, dot values, and I'm going to use that. I'll call it tag, and I'm going to call it version. And we're going to use that for all our 3 containers. And the Docker image we pushed, when I mentioned ECR registry secret, it contains this full address actually in my case. You can do whatever you want. If you want to hard code it, that's fine as well. But I prefer to actually provide it in the pipeline when you push. But that's the registry to our Amazon Docker repository. Okay, so we added a couple of values with value tag version. Since they all are running on the same versions, we don't need different tags. Otherwise, you would probably have like product service, report service version, and things like that. But right now, they are all in sync. So we'll just use that. So now I'm going to add a new file. I'm going to call it values. And in the values field, we want to add tag. We want version. And in this case, the default value will just be latest. But we, of course, want to override this. So hopefully, that's really all we need to define for Helm to pick up what it needs to do. I hope I haven't missed anything, but I don't think so. Let's see here. I'm just checking my notes as well. No, I don't think so. So let's go back to the repository and see how it went with our build, if it failed or if it actually worked. It failed, okay. That's good, I guess. Package and push failed. All right, why? Input required and not supplied AWS region. Okay, I missed something. Let's go back. So we go to the GitHub Actions. I'm gonna double check my notes as well, since we don't really have time to investigate in a simpler fashion. Yes, of course. So I defined up here in AWS my secrets and everything, but I forgot to say what region I actually want to work with. That's really important in Amazon, of course. And the one we are deploying our Kubernetes cluster in is EU North 1, which is in Sweden. Let's push that again, and in this time we will also push in the shard, so let's push that while we work on the rest of the code. I'm going to call it push 3.
So how does Helm know which one is the latest? Is it the timestamp or is it magic?
No, it knows that it's the latest because the next step we will define in our pipeline is going to provide the value. Where did my value go? Did it disappear? Values? Okay, it didn't end up what I was hoping. Is it in templates perhaps? Yeah. So the values is just a way to define these variables are available for me. So whenever I set this tag version to something else, it will pop up in the pod and be replaced in this value here. So that's the way to get it into the actual deployment. Then when Helm runs, it will replace the tags, in this case our hashtag, and add it here instead. You can have whatever values you want. So it's a way to actually add a scripting layer on top of Kubernetes deployment. And that's one of the keys to actually using Helm, I would say. Or at least that's what I find a lot simpler. Otherwise, it's really annoying to actually go in and manipulate existing YAML files for Kubernetes and to actually get these values in correctly. Or you, of course, use some UI or something like that. But if you want to automate it, this is the way to go, I would say. Right, so we pushed that and we changed that. Okay, let's continue. Back to the actions. Now we imagine that we actually have managed the last step, even though we didn't. And we want to actually do a deployment. So in this case, we're going to do something, we just call it Helm deploy. Helm deploy. So now we want to use this information we just provided with the charts. So we're going to do uses again, so we don't have to write everything from scratch. We could have done it with kubectl from scratch, but this package provides a lot of help, so we don't have to. This is an open source from somebody called Coslib. No clue who that is, but he provides us with a really nice feature to actually deploy to EKS. So this is a way to use open source software in a very good way, I would say. We want to provide environment variables. As I mentioned, it needs to know how to actually reach your Kubernetes cluster. And that is available in the kube-config data. And in my case, I provide this using a secret, because I don't really want to share that with the whole world. And that secret's name was kube-config data. So that more or less in the kube configuration data, if you haven't looked into what's actually available in the .kube folder, it contains like connection strings towards, in our case, Amazon, or into Minikube, or whatever you want to connect to. So it's a way for kubectl to actually connect to your instance. Right, so we want to run this with a command. In this case, we want to do Helm upgrade. But we provide an install tag, which means that if it's not an upgrade, it's going to do an initial install instead. We're going to call this deployment DevHour. You can have multiple deployments, but you name if you name them, it's easier to do a rolling upgrade, for example. And we want to, of course, wait until everything is deployed, and we provide our folder called Helm charts. And then comes the most important, which is we want to set, we want to set the tag.version equals, well, our GitHub shop. This is the way to provide Helm with the information it needs. You can provide a full file that is like whatever you want. In this case, I override one variable, but you can of course provide a full YAML file with all the tags set and to correct values if you want to. There are multiple options on providing input towards Helm. And that's all you really need to do. But before we actually push this, I'm gonna do like this as well. I'm gonna say name. And once again, name is just a way to define the step. ID, and we call it URL. I'm gonna do uses. The same guys, lib HELM, EKS, Actions, from master version. Yeah, I'm gonna copy this in, it makes it a little bit faster, like that. It still needs our kube config, right? And all we really want to do in this step is to say with a command kubectl, this you might have recognized from the last time, get ingress. So this is to get our actual load balancer address, so we can actually test the site using a web browser afterwards. So hopefully this is all we really need to deploy it. We take a big shortcut by using an external library that will handle the deployment using HELM. And we just provide the HELM charts that we have already defined. Of course, there are multiple providers of different ways of deploying using HELM. So if you don't want to use this one, it might have some limitations that I'm unaware of. Then go ahead and go with the next one. And let's push this and hope it works. And we can also, in the meantime, see how the last... now I forgot to rename it, but let's see if the last one failed or went good. Okay, that one failed immediately, but the number 3 one worked. And I want to show you one thing here that I forgot to show you. The build, as we said, we built an artifact. You can see it here and you can download it if you want to. So that's the whole package we uploaded. So that can be downloaded if you want to as well, of course, to your own computer to actually get some more overview what actually got built and whatnot. But let's see what failed here in the final step. Nothing. Startup failure. Okay, so this can happen sometimes. Secret located at 55. Okay, let's go to that. Secret should be secrets. That's a simple mistake. I hope that's the only one, but we'll see. Let's call this push 5 then. And we'll go back. And it started to run, that's great. It seems we fixed that initial problem at least. So if you have any questions right now, it's a very good time. Otherwise, it's fine as well, of course. And one thing to consider, I mean, now we're doing this in 1 hour and we have like 2 steps. A pipeline should obviously have more steps than 2. You should have test coverage and things like that. In our build now we do the unit testing, but you probably want a lot of more different type of steps in between. And of course, GitHub Actions, there are, as I mentioned, a lot of different things you can use that is already existing. So have a look on your own and take time to learn what type of packages there are available, like Actions. Because when you want to, for example, set up performance things, and then it gives you a lot of good work beforehand. Okay, so maybe I misspelled it. Costly HELM Actions. I probably misspelled it. Well, let's see. I'm gonna see here. Hopefully did I misspell it? Is that a misspelling? No. Well, that would be a very... That one was misspelled. Okay. So the annoying thing with working with pipelines is obviously that you have to actually push in and wait for the pipeline to finish. There are side projects where you can run this locally. I've actually not tried it myself. But there are open source code that you can actually trigger and run using Docker, I think it is, to run your local pipelines. When you actually work with this, it can become very many pushes until it gets the way you want it. For example, misspelling is a very common reason that it actually fails. So now it has to do everything again. And then there are a lot of things you can consider here as well, right? As I mentioned in the build step, we build an artifact, a big one, for the whole project. Obviously, that could be minimized to just the jar files. Strongly recommended if you want to use this in a real coding environment with many people. And sorry, yeah. I thought I heard a question, but that wasn't a question. Okay, great, sorry. So when you do that, that's really good. But also, as I mentioned, splitting up steps helps a lot as well. Don't build everything in one job, because it's really, really annoying when something fails in one step. And try to use parallel streams here as well, if you can. That speeds up pipelines a lot. So you can run, some steps could potentially run at the same time. Okay, let's hope this one goes better this one time. We can actually watch it. So this is not very fun to watch, of course, but at least we can see what it's doing. So while waiting, the next session is not yet set in date, but it will be we will be starting to add more Java code. We will be adding a service layer and working with Hibernate to learn how to set up entities and using the entity manager and communicate with a database. We will perhaps also add some more API steps as well. So if you want to learn that, also join the next session, I would say. And even if you have full knowledge of it, maybe you catch up on something new. Right, so now it's building our Docker steps, as you can see, with our arguments. And another thing to consider as well when you use this in a real environment, you might want to cache some parts of, for example, the Docker containers. So each layer here is downloaded. That means some of them are already existing somewhere else, right? So, for example, you might want to cache the underlying operating system in the Docker files. So I think we run this on OpenJDK 17, which is a definition for the Docker file. You can cache that, so then the next step that actually needs it, don't have to re-download it again. And there are a lot of things you can use the cache for as well. Right, so now we're actually running the deployment. Let's hope it works. And if it doesn't, we're out of time, but then I can show you a previous run. So just a quick recap. If you want to learn how to use Helm, I strongly recommend just going to helm.com and read about it. It's really, really easy to get started. And for working with Kubernetes, when you start working with CI, I think HELM or something, a different framework called Flux is very good options. You can, of course, go full CI and start thinking about things like Argo CD and things like that as well, which is like another framework with the UI as well, where you can use Helm inside it if you want to. It's really powerful. Right, so it went green. That's great. And if we go to the get URL here, we have an address. So this is a very long address. Obviously, you would want to bind this to a DNS perhaps. Let's go like this. And we say, let's say order service we had. and if I remember correctly, actuator -help, and we hope it's up. It is. Great, so that's everything we need to do to actually get something running. We have 2 steps. I actually think I mentioned 3 in the slides, but in this case it came 2. I forgot to create the third job for actually running HELM, but that's a side exercise for you guys if you want it. The code will be available very soon. And with that said, I think we're running out of time if there are no more questions. Okay, guys, thank you so much for listening in, and make sure you check it out, the code. And next session will be in a month, maybe a little bit more, something like that. And apologies for pushing this for 1 week because of sickness on my part. But thank you all for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. Take care.